Okay, and we're live, guys. We have a very special episode for you today, so thank you very much to everyone who's joining us live. Thanks to everyone who's going to be watching us later as well. I have today Sam and Cliff with me from the Middle East Forum to discuss an organization and to discuss some organizations related to that organization that maybe a lot of Indians in India and maybe even in America are not necessarily aware of. So before we really deep dive into it and discuss it in greater length, let me first welcome to the show Cliff and Sam. Guys, welcome.
Hey, thanks. Good to see you.
So before we get started, Cliff and then Sam, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourselves and a little bit about Middle East Forum?
Sure, you go first.
Oh, go ahead, Cliff.
Well, my name's Cliff. I am from Washington State originally. I moved to Washington, D.C. 12 years ago. I've been working in politics in some capacity or other ever since. I worked for multiple members of Congress for a couple other organizations. Then about 4 years ago, I got the opportunity to come to the Middle East Forum. We deal with the Middle East, as the title suggests. We also deal with radical Islam and radical Islamic movements in the wider sense, which is how we got involved actually in South Asia, because groups like Jamaat-i-Islami are at the heart of sort of the international theocratic radical Islamist movement. Right. And so me and Sam, for several years now, have been working to sort of raise the alarm and raise awareness of Jamaat-i-Islami, Jamaat-i-Islami's franchise groups, their ideology, their friends and partners, and what they're really up to. Because it's not actually that hidden. It's just that a lot of people have not really bothered to discuss it. There's been this preoccupation with the Middle East, with Middle Eastern radicals, with Middle Eastern franchise groups, which are all legitimate issues. But it's precisely because this lack of awareness of South Asian radicalism and how it interacts with all of this, that a lot of these groups and a lot of what they've been up to and a lot of what they believe is flown under the radar. Right. So we have been working to expose that with a lot of our partner organizations.
Sam, give us a little bit of a background on yourself and what you do with the Middle East Forum.
So I'm quite a lot less American than Cliff.
You don't say.
Yeah, right. I moved from Britain about 3-4 years ago. I worked in counter-extremism for the last 10 years. And by counter-extremism, I primarily mean counter-Islamism. So I've worked, for 10 years with various moderate Muslim groups to study and counteract the effect of Islamist groups. We draw a clear distinction between the two, not just me, but the Middle East Forum as well. Right. I direct currently the forum's Islamist Watch program, which, like I said, works to counteract Islamism. But more than that, it works to counteract what we call lawful Islamism or non-violent Islamism. We don't regard the jihadi threat as the primary threat facing India, facing the West, facing the world. We see that the short, explosive threat that happens once every few months, every few years in a Western country is nothing compared to the long-term pernicious threat of a radicalized generation of Muslim youth. And we're already seeing that in Europe take place, and I'm concerned that America will go that way too in 5-10 years' time unless it takes similar steps. India is also very familiar with these as well. So that's what the Islamist Watch does. And as I say, we work with reformist Muslims from various moderate sects around the country. And one more thing I should say about the forum, unlike almost every other anti-Islamist group out there, we are very interested in the makeup of Western Islam. It's not just Sunni and Shia to us. We see that there are hundreds of sects competing for attention, competing to represent the Muslim community, competing theologically, politically, culturally, and we want to delineate Islam into all its parts, both good and bad. And we believe that only by delineating can you identify the bad guys and then find the good guys, and work with one to defeat the other. So that's the forum's work. And obviously, South Asian Islamism, as Cliff mentioned, has become a very key part of that work.
Yeah, it is interesting because when you think of sort of Islamist organizations or Islam-related organizations in the West, you generally think of CARE, which is sort of the most high-profile of these organizations. I think most Americans are familiar with CARE, and I think a large percentage of Indians are probably also familiar with CARE when they think of like Islamic relations or organizations in the West. But Cliff, when it comes to sort of there are other organizations, something that, your articles and when I started actually speaking to you, that really brought to my attention is that there are also other organizations that are not necessarily affiliated or associated or, are directly related to CARE, that are also pretty active in America, and something that should probably interest the South Asian diaspora a little more in the United States and in India and in South Asia in general as well. So talk to me a little bit first, though, about Jamaat-e-Islami, as you were talking about the Middle East Forum and started taking a little bit of interest in that. To talk to me a little bit about, if you can, either of you, about a little bit about Jamaat-e-Islami and its history for people, listening to this in India or the West that might not be necessarily aware.
Sam, why don't you start with that? You're the real expert here.
Okay, so founded in the 1940s, Jamaat-i-Islami is really one of the first organized Islamist groups in the world. Its ideologue, Abdul al-Maududi, sketched out his vision for an Islamic state, for how an Islamic state would interact with the modern world, how it would interact and reject so much of the Western world. And Maududi and Jamaat-i-Islami were inspirations for dozens of Islamist movements around the world that followed, as well as terrorist groups as well. Now, Jamaat-i-Islami grew slowly for many decades until about the 1970s, when Bangladesh fought for its independence from Pakistan. It was East Pakistan at the time.
Right.
The Pakistani army, in an effort to suppress this bid for freedom, worked with Jamaat-i-Islami killing squads to murder Bangladeshi academics, intellectuals, students. Hundreds of thousands were murdered. And as soon as the war was over and Bangladesh won, essentially, formed a new Bangladeshi state, many Jamaat-i-Islami war criminals fled to the West, or around the world, but also to the West. And when they got to the West, they set up new Jamaat-i-Islami institutions. They saw a Muslim community in the West that was without political leadership, that was ripe for the takeover.
Right.
And they did just that. So in the UK, a man called Chaudhry Muinuddin helped set up a number of community groups, including the Islamic Foundation, one of the most prominent Jamaat-i-Islami think tanks in the world, Muslim Aid, one of the largest Jamaat-i-Islami charities in the world, and a whole bunch of other groups. And he became so ingrained with sort of the leadership of British Islam that he was famously photographed meeting Prince Charles.
Wow.
Now, just a few years later, 10 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, a Bangladeshi war crimes tribunal found him guilty of crimes of mass murder.
Wow.
There was this extraordinary disconnect between the fact that someone fated, and by the way, in the UK, this man was doing interfaith work and charity work, and it showed the extraordinary duplicity of Islamist movements, that they can both kill in the East and then exploit in the West. And that's exactly how Jamaat-i-Islami operates in the world today. The same is true here in the United States as well. One of the men convicted with Chaudhry Muinuddin, a man called Ashraf Zaman Khan, fled to the US. He became very involved in a group called the Islamic Circle of North America, key Jamaat-i-Islami outposts here in the US. This happened all over the world. Cliff and I have spent the last 2 years investigating this, looking at these Jamaat-i-Islami proxies, trying to understand how Jamaat-i-Islami works, examining its continued links with Jamaat-i-Islami branches in India, in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh, and understanding its links to terror finance and to radicalization networks. South Asia has been woefully ignored when it comes to the Islamist threat, not just in South Asia, but within the diaspora communities here in the US as well. And for decades, Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi diaspora communities have been warning us that there are extremists in their community who want to exploit their leadership and advance an extremist agenda, and no one listened. They were absolutely right. And now, we're trying to do something about it, and we hope the policymakers, media, and the public follow suit.
So, Cliff, Sam mentioned ICNA.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about ICNA now and its relationship with Jamaat, and what it's been doing, what it's been up to in the United States?
So Islamic Circle of North America, or ICNA, is a very old organization, at least by the standards of American Islamism. They are predate CARE by 20 years, somewhere around there. They were first set up in the 70s, and actually Madudi, before he died, I think 2 years before he died, actually attended their first public sort of launching event in New York. And so it's not like they hide their ideological affiliation.
Right.
They have explained that they exist to forward the teachings of Madudi and to support Jamaat-i-Islami in Pakistan. They have said these things in their own newsletters multiple times. So you can, try to create whatever sort of legal fiction or, whatever kind of dance you want. They are Jamaat-i-Islami, and everybody that looks at this for more than 2 seconds knows it. Vali Nasser, a scholar at Johns Hopkins, wrote a book on Jamaat-i-Islami in the 90s. Again, this guy isn't even particularly right-wing. He was one of Obama's advisors. He's not somebody that necessarily tends to agree with some of the counter-Islamist crowd on a lot of things. Yet, in his book on Jamaat-i-Islami, he says explicitly, there are 8 significant chapters of Jamaat-i-Islami in the world. One of them is ICNA. He says it explicitly, no bones, and this is someone, very prominent, very mainstream, high-profile professor. Nobody really doubts this.
Right.
That looks at it. And so Islamic Circle of North America bills itself as an innocuous, social organization, good works organization, so-and-so for Muslim Americans. And for a lot of people that are involved in it, they probably don't know any better. But it is entirely clear that they exist to legitimize the teachings of Madudi, to legitimize a form of radical political Islam. And they have gone about doing so. And they go about doing so the way a lot of groups do. They try to do good works. They try to put on a good public face. They try to talk to their officials. And they slowly churn out people that agree with them and try to make friends and influence people. The problem is they are indeed radicals. They are indeed theocrats. And we have seen numerous instances of them engaged in very troubling behavior. For example, Islamic Relief, or Islamic Circle of North America has 2 sub-organizations, Islamic Circle of North America Relief and Islamic and Helping Hands for Relief and Development. At least ostensibly, Islamic Circle of North America Relief is supposed to do domestic good works. And HHRD, Helping Hands for Relief and Development, is their self-declared sister organization that does international work. Now, their domestic arm has gotten tens of millions of dollars from the government, sadly, which helps legitimize their way of looking at things, their way of doing things, which helps build them into a leader in the Muslim community, something that is frankly not earned. But HHRD in particular has done some very troubling things. For example, we have it in writing in their own legal document that they sponsored a conference in Pakistan where 2 branches of Lashkar-e-Taiba were part of this conference that they sponsored. Pakistan media reports that this entire conference was arranged by HHRD and that Lashkar-e-Taiba had a prominent speaking role. They deny these last 2 parts, but this is very prominently reported, not by some right-wing nut conspiracy theorist, but prominently in Pakistani media. That's what they say. And they admit to sponsoring the conference.
Yeah, and just to remind that, Lashkar, I'm sure most of the viewers here know what Lashkar-e-Taiba is. For those who don't, this group, led by a man called Hafiz Saeed, is responsible for the murder of tens of thousands of people over many decades, including most famously the 2008 Mumbai attacks, in which over 160 people were murdered. Lashkar-e-Taiba is a designated terrorist organization in the United States, as are its proxies with which Helping Hand runs the land.
Yes, which is the Falah Insanat Foundation and the Muli Muslim League, which are all separately designated. And Helping Hands also openly, very, very openly, has hundreds of ongoing projects with the Al-Khidmat Foundation. Al-Khidmat is the explicit, you can find it 100 times on their website, on Twitter, explicit charitable arm of Jamaat-i-Islami. And there is all the experts in the region have said for years that all they really are is sort of the charitable arm of Hizbul Mujahideen. They support what Hizbul Mujahideen is doing. They take care of the people that Hizbul wants them to, so on and so forth. It is still on the web available we can send you the link, where Al-Khidmat openly brags about sending money to Hamas.
Right.
It's still available. I mean, it's not really hidden who Al-Khidmat is, and yet to this day, you can go to HHRD's website and they are bragging, we have 200 and some projects running with Al-Khidmat.
Wow.
So I don't want to, claim more or less than we know. This is what we know. But this is a pattern of very troubling behavior with people that, if they are indeed exactly who they are, supporters of Madudi, supporters of Jamaat-i-Islami, well, of course they're going to partner with Jamaat-i-Islami.
Right.
Of course they're going to do all this stuff. And what we have been trying to do is shine a light on these facts because very few people know about them.
Is there any particular reason, Cliff, let me just stay with you for a second, that Jamaat and all its related organizations drew your attention over the, last couple of years or so? Is this something that they started to do differently, or was it just something that you sort of noticed in the last couple of years?
Ironically, I hate to call tragic events fortuitous, but we had been involved at first because we knew that the student wing of Jamaat in Bangladesh had been very, very violent in 2014 in the run-up to the elections. And us, with some of our partners, such as a group called Liberty South Asia, became very concerned that basically in the run-up to the 2018 elections in Bangladesh, there would be mass violence again. And we figured one way to counter that was to let them know that the US was watching. And so we started educating lawmakers and policy makers and the public about who Jamaat was and about what could happen in Bangladesh. And we convinced some people in Congress to sort of pay attention to this. There was a resolution introduced in 2018 that called attention to the upcoming elections in Bangladesh and called for a non-violent peaceful election. And obviously, I can't prove cause and effect, but that did get a great deal of coverage in Bangladesh, and there was no violence. I think Jamaat did know that they had a spotlight on them if anything went wrong, in a way that they hadn't before. And then after that, though, we had been studying Jamaat in a much larger sense, and Sam in particular had done a lot of original research on what they were up to in the U.S. and discussing what was going on in South Asia. And so when the next Congress came in play in 2019, we started talking. People said, hey, look, it's really good that we condemn them in Bangladesh, but this is a much wider problem. They have proxies. They work in India, in Kashmir, so on and so forth. We need to call attention to this too, and we've gone about doing that. And then, again, I hate to call this fortuitous, but this is horrifying, but then you had the terrorist attacks in Kashmir that killed 40 Indian police officers. You had the Indian government banning Jamaat in Kashmir because they were working so closely with Hizbul Mujahideen. I mean, Hizbul Mujahideen is essentially the armed wing of Jamaat-i-Islami. You had all these events which all of a sudden made Jamaat-i-Islami a much hotter topic. And we gave a lot, and especially since the Islamists are trying to drive the narrative in Kashmir entirely, it became very important to say, look, if you want to criticize the length of, the denial of internet services to Kashmir, fine. But let's not lose sight of what is causing this. This didn't come out of the ground. This didn't, just come out of nowhere. This was because there are militant groups on the ground. There are radical ideological extremists that are prone to violence on the ground that are being dealt with. And you need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Sam, you guys were talking about how there are many people and organizations that are involved with ICNA and Jamaat-related institutions and organizations. And I'm sure a lot of these organizations are good people and a lot of these people are good people. Do they have an idea of what Jamaat stands for? The way Jamaat sort of operates in Bangladesh and Afghanistan, the way Jamaat is instrumental in suppressing any kind of free speech, any kind of dissent in the name of blasphemy laws, and the way it openly talks about establishing an Islamic state based on Sharia principles and all of that stuff. If you think that somebody rational would hear about these things that Jamaat wants to do and Jamaat has been doing in Pakistan and Bangladesh, they'd run screaming. Do you think that they have an idea of what Jamaat is up to or ICNA is related with, or do they just choose to ignore because it's it's Islamophobia if you talk about it.
So ICNA is one of the community groups of choice for many
Right.
South Asian Muslims across this country. And undoubtedly a large proportion of those people take part because they want something that is culturally relevant to them,
Right.
as well as religiously relevant, perhaps. The leaders of ICNA are a different story. The leaders of the Islamic Circle in North America are Jamaat-i-Islami operatives. They know exactly what the movement represents. They know exactly what the movement has done, both in Bangladesh, in India, in Kashmir, and Pakistan. You can see that by the way that Jamaat is structured and how it operates. The study circles it runs, where it studies Jamaat-i-Islami literature. The charities like Helping Hand they set up that work with terrorist groups in Pakistan.
Right.
The rhetoric that comes out of ICNA about Kashmir and about Modi and about India and the BJP, this is a highly politicized group. No one in a leadership position is under any illusion of what ICNA means and what it represents. One of the things the Forum very much believes is that it's very important to delineate Islam into all its different parts, not just Sunni and Shia, but the hundreds of different movements that are separated by jurisprudence, theology, culture, ethnicity, belief in certain mysticisms, and so on. There are hundreds, thousands of different Islamic movements and sects around the world. Jamaat-i-Islami is just one of those movements, and yet it has managed to set up an institution that claims to speak for a very large number of South Asian Muslims, which include Barelwi, Deobandi, and Sufi Muslims from across South Asia who have nothing in common with Jamaat-i-Islami. This is why ICNA is so dangerous, though. It's managed to form, or at least impose itself as a sort of an umbrella representative of all these different peoples, all these different groups. Certainly, the leaders know what ICNA and Jamaat-i-Islami is about. I'm pretty sure most of their supporters, the people who attend their events, do not. And I will just mention, I've had over the last 2 years a couple of people from ICNA, at least members of ICNA, not leaders of ICNA, reach out to me and say, hi, I've noticed some of these extremist rules in ICNA. I don't think ICNA was always this way, or ICNA doesn't have to be this way. Don't condemn the whole of ICNA, that kind of thing. So obviously there is, I disagree with the idea that ICNA was not always Jamaat-i-Islami, but obviously there is discussion among the lay members, the ordinary people who attend ICNA events, about the kind of people in control. And I think things like Kashmir at the moment are really shining a light on the extremist ideology that ICNA and Helping Hand subscribe to. What we need now is American Muslims, South Asian Muslims to have an alternative, to have somewhere to go, to have, represent their culture, their religion, that is not also part of an international Islamist movement with a lot of blood on its hands.
Right. Yeah. And, when you say as well, Sam, that South Asian Muslims, Indian Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, Bangladeshi Muslims living in the United States, living in the West, need alternatives to those organizations. But it almost appears that even the alternatives that have come up in certain cases kind of toe the same line that ICNA and those Jamaat-related organizations have been towing. Is ever since, Cliff, this whole Kashmir thing happened, the abrogation of Article 370, and then on top of that, the Citizenship Amendment Act, all of that stuff happened. There's been this upsurge of sort of dissent against this idea in the West, in India, obviously, particularly among Muslims group, particularly among South Asian groups. And a lot of those, organizations involved in it, like one of the big organizations that sort of came out of nowhere almost in response to the abrogation of Article 370 was this group called Stand with Kashmir, right? Almost came out of nowhere. Almost, everybody was suddenly talking about Stand with Kashmir. Everybody was suddenly talking about supporting Stand with Kashmir. And you have these student groups in, United States universities called Students Against Hindutva Ideology. They're now openly partnering with Stand of Kashmir as, Stand with Kashmir is some sort of like defender of democracy and freedom and free speech and all of that fun stuff. And it is when you sent me all those articles and I started reading up a little bit more on Middle East Forum that I realized that what Stand with Kashmir and how Stand with Kashmir and organizations like that have been working with ICNA, because I think it was one of your articles where I read that Stand with Kashmir had organized some protest against the Indian government's decision, which was attended by ICNA leaders as well.
Yeah. No, they Stand with Kashmir and ICNA are openly aligned in holding protests, and they have billboards, called Free Kashmir billboards, and all this kind of stuff. They are openly aligned, and they are working to the same common end. Stand with Kashmir is a very shady organization. Frankly, we know very little about it. We don't know even where they are incorporated. We don't know how they get money. We don't know who their leadership is. We know who a few of their public faces are. But I mean, like you mentioned, it came out of nowhere and then has just all of a sudden become this thing. And all we can tell you is that all these different Islamist groups, ICNA is probably the highest profile one in terms of direct partnership, but they are clearly working together for the same goal, and they are working with other ones. As you mentioned, I believe you mentioned earlier, CARE or the Islamic Society of North America, a separate group that was more Middle Eastern originated from Middle Eastern leadership, but they're working together with different groups towards this common end. But exactly how this works, we don't know exactly, because there is like almost complete lack of transparency. I have my suspicions, which I'll keep to myself for now. But it's a very interesting phenomenon. All you can say, though, is when a group comes out of nowhere, appears to be fairly well funded and have a whole lot of friends overnight, somebody's doing something that they don't want you to fully understand. That they are trying to keep some of their motivations, some of their friends secret.
I might be a little more controversial than Cliff and actually name who I think might be behind this. On the grounds that in the past, I know that...
Now we have a podcast.
We know that American Islamists have worked with agents for Pakistan's ISI in the past. People who've been convicted in the US of serving as ISI agents. It would not surprise me if there was ISI involvement. I'm not saying Kashmir is backed by the ISI. I've got no evidence to show that. But it would not surprise me if Pakistan's ISI was backing much of the anti-Indian Kashmiri protests that are happening in the US right now. That would make sense to me based on my experience with Pakistani interference in Muslim communities in both Britain and the US. There is one more thing we can say on Stand with Kashmir, and it's a bit of a plug really for an article we're about to produce. My colleague Martha Lee has done some pretty explosive research into Stand with Kashmir and has uncovered links and support that they offer for a number of terrorist operatives in Kashmir who have called for the killing of Indians, who are responsible for the killing of Indians.
That's true.
This will be published within the next week, and I'm plugging it here, so I recommend you keep
go on.
Forum. I'm hoping this will get the media interested in what exactly this group is. I'm hoping it will get policymakers more aware of what this group is doing and starting to question who's behind it. You said this came about overnight. It's a very dangerous organization. And I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that this is a front for international Islamism and its malign state backers.
And I'm forgetting the name, but one of the interesting things about them is that some of their leadership comes from formerly Middle East focused Islamist groups. Sam, maybe you remember, there's one of their spokespeople was previously affiliated with Students for Justice in Palestine. I'm forgetting their name.
There's a couple of people involved from Islamist activism groups, mostly to do with Palestine, often Hamas connected. And this is actually part of a wider point of interest that so much of the Kashmir and anti-Indian movements in the US emerges directly from the pro-Hamas movements, the anti-Israel pro-Hamas movement. And Islam is very keen to paint that parallel. And you now see groups like there's academics at Zaytuna College, a very prominent college that's part of Berkeley in California, an Islamist-run college, that is now, one of their academics is now producing reports on the evils of Islamophobia in India and equating it to the actions of Israel against Palestinians. So there is a very keen attempt to paint both India and Israel in the same sort of imperialist, cruel
that was going to be my next point as well, Cliff, is that what I'd at least noticed over the past couple of months, because I've been following what the Indian government did with the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, is that ever since that's happened, my obviously awareness of Islamic groups in America for a while was limited to just CARE and its sort of associated groups there. But then I started noticing all these, CARE talking about Kashmir quite openly. And then you have politicians that are associated with CARE openly, like Ilhan Omar, like Rashida Tlaib, talking about Kashmir openly. Then you have Bernie Sanders at an Islamic conference, ISNACON conference, openly from their stage, talking about Kashmir. The same conference, which I think you mentioned as well, had Imran Khan giving a speech there. So there is clearly some sort of cross-pollination happening between these various Islamist, whatever you want to call them, groups, where they're communicating with each other, and they're talking about these issues and coordinating and talking about these issues. The reason why I say I feel like there's this coordination in talking about these issues is because all the points that they make about the situation in Kashmir are bloody identical. Everything they say is fascism, Hindu fascism, murder of Muslims, genocide of Muslims. That is it. There is no mention of 400,000 Kashmiri Hindus driven out of the valley. There is no mention of how Kashmiri Hindus had to live, scared of their own shadows in their homes for 50 years before they actually did get kicked out. There's no mention of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism and how Pakistan, how there are these mujahideens coming from across the border, how you have Afghan, Pakistani Pashtun nationals dying in Kashmir at the hands of the army. None of that is being mentioned at all. So it really makes me think that because all of these organizations are basically reading from the same script, there has to be some sort of cross-pollination.
Yes, I think that's part of it. I think it's important to think, look, I would not be shocked at all if, they are trading emails and phone calls and discussing what to say. At the same time, if you look, you don't necessarily need that much to get there, I don't think. When you have a bunch of people that agree on sort of the broad goal that, is some form of Islamic theocracy is good, things that are not some form of Islamic theocracy is bad, it's not that hard to come up with some talking points. And frankly, it's not that hard to look at what your friends are doing and say, hey, let's do something like that. And just sort of, it's not like, frankly, that their rhetoric on this, as you point out, is particularly deep or insightful. It's really more just sort of beating the drum talking points that sound good to people that know absolutely nothing. So, it's entirely possible, and there certainly has been people, there are people that are associated with Jamaat-i-Islami that work for some of the more Middle Eastern-focused Islamist groups, and vice versa. So yeah, certainly there's some cross-pollination, but also it's just a matter of, ideological similarities and common interests. If you are looking at the world from that point of view, it's not that hard to get there.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And, especially with when you said, I read in one of your articles that you have Ilhan Omar and people like that are doing video interviews with Stand With Kashmir. That lends Stand With Kashmir, an already extremely shady organization, a great amount of legitimacy, being associated with somebody like Ilhan Omar, who has the ear of the population in such a way, right, Sam?
Yeah.
Sorry, Smith, go ahead, complete your point.
Well, I just would want to point out, and I can let Sam take more of it, but the thing I wanted to point out that I thought was really interesting that has not gotten nearly enough attention, because it's a sort of weird fact that you kind of have to dig down a little bit to really understand why it's relevant. But Ilhan Omar's been in Congress not that long. Because of her past and her sort of exotic way of doing things, she's been a lightning rod on both sides. But, she made her name for her first year or so in office, mostly talking about the Middle East, talking about Israel, talking about, da-da-da-da-da. Then, towards the end of last year, however, she got in this explosive exchange at a subcommittee hearing on human rights in South Asia, which ended up focusing mostly on Kashmir, with the Indian reporter Arti Tiku Singh, who she, just attacked brutally with very little facts. And here's an interesting thing about that. She wasn't a member of the subcommittee that was holding the hearing.
Right.
She
Yeah.
actually had to get a waiver to speak at the subcommittee hearing that she did this at. So in other words, she jumped completely out of her way to go after a woman who was driven from the Kashmiri Valley when she was young in order to go after her specifically. So you can see that.
And incidentally, if I may just quickly add a point, she on that panel that the committee had invited to speak about human rights in Kashmir or whatever. On that entire panel, Aarti Tikku Singh was the only journalist that had actually been on the ground in Kashmir and reported the situation from being on the ground in Kashmir. She was the only person that knew firsthand what the hell was going on in Kashmir. And she was the one that was called a mouthpiece of the government.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. And you can see that, though, this is how much this has become sort of a cause overnight, that someone that was from Africa that made their focus in the Middle East all of a sudden jumps to Kashmir, specifically because I think Aarti Singh represented a threat to that narrative, because she had been on the ground, because she was a Kashmiri Pandit, because she did know what was going on, because she had experience with dealing with and reporting on Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the explicitly jihadi groups that are at the heart of the problem. And she didn't want, that was a threat to the narrative that she wanted painted, which I'm convinced is why, she worked her way onto into a subcommittee hearing that she wasn't even originally supposed to be part of.
Right. So yeah, it almost seems like, Sam, that these Islamic groups are now sort of using the Kashmir issue as sort of a rallying point, right? Like Cliff mentioned, that even somebody like Ilhan Omar, who ostensibly has no connection to Kashmir whatsoever, like it's never been really her interest. Her interest has been talking more about Middle Eastern issues in Africa and Israel and Palestine and all of that stuff. Suddenly switching focus to Kashmir in such a manner and speaking so openly about Kashmir, it's almost like they found a good rallying point, in their opinion, of rallying the Muslim base, maybe getting some funding out, maybe getting some narrative together, maybe getting some more people elected.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And let's state something actually that's, to me, is very clear.
Right.
Islamists, these extremists, and their supporters in Congress do not care about the people of Kashmir. They don't. Of
course.
Kashmir, as you say, is a rallying point. Ultimately, this is about power and control, legitimacy. This is a way for Islamist movements to assert leadership over Western Islam by becoming the political voice, the activist voice of American Muslims. And so when the Palestinian territories in the news, that's the issue. When Kashmir is in the news, issue. The quicker they can point to something like, point to the RSS, point to the BJP, point to Modi and say fascist, racist, imperialist, that chimes with the leftist rhetoric that wins them grants from left-leaning foundations, that wins them partnerships, alliances with left-leaning activist groups. It's something that brings them into the progressive fold and makes them part of the mainstream. This is about power, almost nothing else, really. And when the next crisis happens somewhere, you'll see them get together over that. And just like Kashmir, they won't actually care.
And just quickly to the point about, you made a very good point about they don't really care about the people in Kashmir. And with the Citizenship Amendment Act as well, I really want to make this point really quickly, because they talk about how they care about these people. They talk about how they, how they really worry about these people. But any of the arguments that they offer does not make them sound like they worry about these people. Because, in Minnesota recently, they passed some kind of motion against the Indian government on the Citizenship Amendment Act. And the reason that they gave was that it's very anti-Dalit, anti-scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, essentially. But the problem with that argument is that under the Citizenship Amendment Act, the Hindus that are getting to come to India and that are getting to become citizens in India are overwhelmingly Dalit, are overwhelmingly scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The people that are escaping persecution in Bangladesh and the people that are escaping persecution in Afghanistan or Pakistan are overwhelmingly Dalit. So the whole edifice that they're constructing falls down when you ask that question. And my question to you as well, Cliff, would be, one of the articles that I believe I read, I think you wrote it, Sam, or maybe Cliff wrote it. I can't remember exactly, but it was about how the American government is funding these organizations. And what I fail to understand is that what is the understanding of this issue among the sort of political class in America? Do they understand what ICNA is? Do they understand what ICNA's connection to Jamaat-e-Islami is? Do they understand what Jamaat-e-Islami stands for? Do they understand what Jamaat-e-Islami has been up to in South Asia? Do they? Go on.
I think you need to differentiate different parts of the government. You cannot say this. I will say that the awareness government-wide is extremely low. I do not think the overwhelming majority of members of Congress understand this at all, and even the ones that do, it's in a very small depth. I do not know that, even so, and maybe a few of the smartest people at the White House, the State Department, know a little bit about it. I do not think it is super deep. However, and this is a significant however, one thing that is public that I can say is that a former ICNA HHRD associate, Fareed Khan, who was a mechanic in Connecticut, that made, I think, $40,000 a year, saw hundreds of thousands of dollars go through his bank account. And he ended up getting swept up in a counterterrorism operation in a joint counterterrorism task force that involved the FBI, DHS, one or two other agencies. I can't remember them all. And he was convicted of lying to the government. Now, they didn't convict him of terror finance, sadly, although it's pretty clear to me, and even in the government's press releases, they allude to the fact that he was sending, he was essentially part of a money laundering operation, is what the court documents make it appear. He was sending expensive medical equipment to his brother, who was a pretty open supporter of Lashkar-e-Taiba. And hundreds of thousands of dollars went through the bank account of this man who made $40,000 a year as a mechanic. So clearly, whoever investigated and prosecuted that case understands that this guy, he is a problem. They understand he's affiliated with ICNA. My guess is that there are a number of people sort of in those security investigative agencies that are aware of who they are and concerned. Again, I am not saying that ICNA or HHRD is a giant terror finance operation. I have no evidence of that. I do have evidence, however.
We've seen this before. Sorry to interrupt, Cliff. We've seen this before with other groups. It's just worth pointing out. At the same time, the FBI was looking, or at least some federal departments were looking into a very large Islamist charity called Islamic Relief.
Right.
The Obama administration and then the Trump administration were giving Islamic Relief money, were running, were sending. So this happens before. As Cliff says, the lack of communication in government between one department, so it could end up that law enforcement ends up investigating a group that the USAID is funding and that the Department of Treasury is running events with. That's pretty extraordinary. Cliff, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Sam. I mean, that's really the issue, is that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. That's sort of the I think that the separation of powers and even within the administration is in many ways is a good thing, and keeps too much hands on power of people. I'm for all that, but at the same time, there are negative side effects, and you see it with this kind of thing where you have, one agency that is investigating the leadership of these organizations for various things, or even other members that might plausibly have something to do with the organization, but other people funding them. And again, as we pointed out, there are people that are in leadership in some of these organizations that are convicted Bangladeshi war criminals. Right. Now, we don't recognize Bangladesh's war crimes tribunals for a variety of diplomatic and legal reasons that frankly I haven't delved into that deeply. It's extremely complicated. Right. But it's known that these people were convicted of war crimes in Bangladesh, and given that the Department of Homeland Security is usually tasked with investigating these kinds of things, I mean, let's just say there's reason to think that they are aware of this and, look into it. Let's hope so. But again, so it is a matter of certain branches of government get it, a lot don't. And so
there is a third point as well.
Right.
And then I don't have an example in the US, but in the UK, very quickly. In the UK, where a very similar situation, the government was funding Jamaat-i-Islami groups, was working with them. Government reports did acknowledge that Jamaat-i-Islami were in charge of this group. Right. And unlike the American government, the British government is much more centralized. So there was an instance in which a Western government was acknowledging the extremists in control of the Muslim community, but choosing to fund them anyway. And many years later, in 2016, the British government released a report that was the result of an inquiry into the Muslim Brotherhood, but it considered Jamaat-i-Islami as well. And what that report concluded is that for decades, government have known that Islamists are in charge of Muslim community groups, but they have worked with them anyway because they have non-violent Islamists as a moderate alternative to the jihadists. Even though we may not agree with these guys, they're better than Al-Qaeda. That was the thing. Despite the fact they're involved in terror finance, they're horrible hatred against Hindus, against Jews, against homosexuals, against women. The government said, you know what, that's horrible, but they're not Al-Qaeda. That was the thinking. And that's the mindset that we have to get rid of in the government. I have no doubt that's happening here in the US as well.
Right.
Yeah, and the issue becomes is a debate that, frankly, I think is settled, but that is still some people refuse to acknowledge is over, and that is whether non-violent Islamism or just non-terroristic, whatever you want to call it, sort of this theocratic supremacist mindset is a bulwark against terrorism and violence, or if it is a conveyor belt to terrorism and violence.
Right.
I mean, this really is such a silly debate from the start. I can't understand how it ever got started. I mean, if you were to say to someone that, well, we understand that the KKK is bad, but as long as they're the non-violent KKK, they're okay, they would laugh at you because they would realize, well, look, if you really hate, African Americans and really hate Jews and really hate Catholics, there's a pretty good chance that at some point you're going to start, cross burning.
Right.
That would seem obvious to any normal person. For some reason, they refuse to admit that is the case when it comes to Islamic radicalism. And they refuse to admit that, okay, look, Islam is not all the same thing. There are different parts of it. There are different interpretations. There are different sects. And ones that are theocratic, ones that are supremacist are bad, and other ones are not so much. But to not realize that that sort of ideology can lead to violence in a hurry is just madness. And in any other context, people would understand that. And frankly, there's nobody that understands that better than moderates in their own countries. I mean, if you want to hear somebody that really doesn't like Jamaat, talk to the majority of Bangladeshis.
Right.
They understand this very, very well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talk to people that want to speak their mind in Pakistan, something like that. Talk to people who want to criticize the Jamaat in Pakistan, because you have these Jamaat student groups, I think it's called Jamiat-e-Talaba. Jamaat student groups in Pakistan, they're notorious for suppressing dissent on college campuses. They will say that if you speak up something that the Jamaat, if you say something that the Jamaat doesn't like, Jamiat-e-Talaba goons will show up at your campus door and they'll beat the crap out of you. So I mean, that's the environment that they've cultivated in a country like Pakistan, where no discussion or dissent can even happen. So no evolution can happen if no discussion can happen. So that's where they're stuck. I also feel, really quickly before I make a point, I want to just quickly acknowledge a super chat. Arukard the Immortal, thanks a lot, mate. Appreciate you. But I also think that the reason why people don't know about these, Jamaat groups and ICNA and people that are associated with it, even in the government, possibly, I think, is because, and I don't know what you make of this, Sam, but I think it's also possibly because in the United States, people know more about CARE because CARE's main grudge has traditionally been with Israel. And in the United States, there's a greater recognition of the Israel situation, the conflict around Israel, and there's a greater amount of support for Israel among Americans as well. So people will take interest and people will take cognizance of stuff that happens when it's concerning Israel. But in terms of India, there aren't that many Indians / or Hindus in America in any way. People, I don't think, know that much about India to begin with. And then if things are happening in faraway India, even if it's like terrible, horrible Islamist organizations involved with it, maybe because of that, there isn't the cognizance that an organization like Jamaat and related organizations like ICNA can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous than CARE, right?
I think there's 2 points here. You're absolutely right with all of this. There's 2 points here. One, CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood, which arguably founded CARE, are better known in the US because, well, firstly, CARE was involved peripherally, was involved in a very important terror finance trial in 2008.
Right.
The government named it an unindicted co-conspirator in this terror finance case, which surrounded the movement of money from an American charity called the Holy Land Foundation to front groups for the terrorist organization Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So CARE was then blacklisted by the FBI and was the subject of many congressional inquiries and that sort of thing. So there was political recognition that CARE posed a threat, and that evolved to then public recognition and even international recognition of people understanding that CARE is not a regular organization. It represents something a little more extreme, something with an ideological agenda. ICNA escaped attention in that trial. It wasn't an unindicted co-conspirator. It was mentioned in the document, but it escaped attention. And while everyone then focused on CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood, especially the right, and I'm critical of the American right for this, they obsessed over the Muslim Brotherhood. And that meant other Islamist groups like Jamaat-i-Islami could flourish with impunity because no one was paying them any attention. And so they've become very powerful now, as have other Islamist movements. Salafis, Deobandis in America all have great influence because everyone has been obsessed, overly obsessed with the Muslim Brotherhood. The other point to make is that, yes, CARE for many years has focused on Israel, as has much of the American Islamist movement.
Right.
And one of the things, of course, one of the reasons that CARE is known, I think, is because many Jewish groups and conservative and pro-Israel groups have, because of that obsession with destruction of Israel and support for Palestinian militants, they have drawn attention to CARE's extremism as a way of advocating for Israel, or at least defending it against CARE's attacks. The Indian community, of course, does not really, or at least this is new for it. I think it can probably learn a great deal from the Jewish community, both in what was successful for the Jewish community and also what was very unsuccessful for the Jewish community.
Right.
Jews and Indians are in a very similar situation in the United States. We're both under attack by Islamists. Our homes in faraway lands are the objects of threats, violent threats by these Islamists. Groups like CARE, groups like ICNA are leading these violent ideas and attempts to delegitimize and denigrate something important. Both of us. It is vital that both communities work together on this. Vital, absolutely vital.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very good point. I think there needs to be more collaboration between, or at least discussions between, the Jewish and Hindu communities, Indian communities, about this common threat that they do face. And Cliff, I read one of your articles where I think you guys did a conference with, I think it was Jim Banks from Indiana.
Correct.
Where there was, at least amongst certain politicians, at least Jim Banks, there was this recognition of this problem. Do you think, how much of this recognition do you think, apart from somebody like Jim Banks, is there? Or is that recognition growing? Is it not growing quickly enough? Like, what's your assessment of this recognition of this problem at this point in time?
In its infancy, but growing. That would be the simple version. I mean, as far as raising the awareness of this issue in Washington, to brag a little bit about our work, I mean, nobody has really done it until we have been involved in trying to educate both the general public, but specifically Washington policymakers, until we started getting involved. We have been, Sam really wrote some groundbreaking articles about Jamaat and what they're up to in the West. And we have been raising the attention of some of his research to people in Washington, members of Congress, to people in state, Homeland Security, so on and so forth. Just making them aware. And, I think we've been getting a pretty good response. But this is after a long time of both almost complete ignorance on the part of many people in the government, not through any ill intent, just for a lack of focus of anybody that raising the issue.
Right.
And also, frankly, Jamaat has spent years whitewashing itself to the federal government in different ways, both their foreign and domestic branches. And Sam can talk more about that. He did some groundbreaking work on how they've been doing that in terms of, even their foreign arms reaching out to America to whitewash themselves in Washington. Sam, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. About a year ago, a man called Abdul Razak, Bangladeshi Jamaat-i-Islami leader, came to DC, met with very prominent think tanks, met with think tank officials, met with very prominent administration officials, as well as legislators and various committee members. We would be very naive if we didn't think every single branch of Jamaat-i-Islami around the world is attempting to influence American politics. We know it's seen that is doing this. Of course, Islamists all around the world, they hire PR guys, they hire lobbyists and lawyers. DC is awash with representatives, paid representatives of the world's most dreadful Islamist movements.
Right.
And I think this is a surprise to many people. It's very important we don't forget it when we're considering how to counteract the threat that this movement poses. There's one example, Bangladeshi Islamist movement. The Bangladeshi branch of Jamaat-i-Islami, its main proxy in the US is another group we haven't discussed called the Muslim Ummah of North America. One of their leaders was also, his brother was also a Jamaati war criminal. They have been working very hard in DC over the last 10 years to lobby in favor of Bangladesh's Jamaat-i-Islami against the War Crimes Tribunal. These groups are organized. They're much more organized than even we realized years ago. Again, working together with other people concerned about this threat, Hindus, Bangladeshis, the Jewish community, Christian community, working together to counteract this threat, to understand the extent of this threat is imperative. This is not an abstract political matter. These groups, they kill. While they kill, they lobby your legislators. They hoodwink your journalists.
I just find this incredibly funny, but there is actually some FARA filings that are, so that's the Foreign Agent Registration Act. So this is explicitly people that are admitting that they are being funded by a foreign entity. And they had a contract with a lobbying firm in DC that the explicit goal of this contract, which is public, was to ensure that Jamaat-i-Islami of Bangladesh is not seen as a security threat by the United States government. I mean, in black and white, in so many words. I mean, they don't hide it. You just have to look. And, to me, that's one of those, sort of damning with faint praise. Oh, okay, so you're saying you don't want to be seen as a security threat. That's almost admitting that you are a security threat. And that's as close as you can get without actually saying, I am a security threat. But they are openly doing that. And they are openly hiring powerful law firms. They are openly working with other groups to whitewash themselves. That actually leads us to something that we've been discussing lately. And this is specifically about this, again, HHRD, Islamic Circle North America's foreign arm that has been involved with these radicals in Kashmir. This is a group that we've been very concerned about recently. It's called Interaction. Interaction is an umbrella group for hundreds, around 200 different charities, most of which are innocuous, and they are multi-religious and not religious. However, they recently formed a sub-umbrella of 5 core charities, among which are HHRD, among which are Islamic Relief, a large Muslim Brotherhood founded charity, one of the founders of which became briefly the foreign minister of Egypt when Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, briefly was in control.
And another charity, sorry to interrupt, Cliff, another charity, one of these core members, is the Zakat Foundation of America, which is almost the semi-official charitable arm of the Turkish regime here in the US. Let's not forget that the Turkish regime has been very vocal on Kashmir, Pakistan, and Kashmiri militants, and the same with its properties here in the US. Sorry, Cliff.
Oh, nothing else. That's absolutely true, and they're they are the Together Project, the sub-umbrella, explicitly, I mean, again, we're quoting from their website.
Right.
Their entire purpose is to supposedly combat disinformation. Excuse me. It's to weaken certain terror finance laws explicitly. They talk about this openly. It is to, prevent discrimination, and they say, crack down on these, conspiracy theorists that are criticizing them, ignoring the fact that, for example, Islamic Relief is banned in both Israel and the UAE. Again, we have both Jews and Arabs agreeing here that they are terror financiers. The government of Bangladesh has banned them from working with Rohingya refugees because they're concerned about radicalization.
Right.
A Tunisian Commission on Terror Finance accused them of giving money to jihadis in Libya. Again, we can go on. Multiple governments in Europe have said they are an explicit arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. On and on and on. And yet, all of this information coming from governmental sources, coming from official sources, from well-regarded news reporters, so on and so forth. This is all misinformation and crackpot conspiracy theorists, according to the Together Project. And they have been openly lobbying Congress against the efforts of the people that have been trying to look into some of the concerns that we've raised. Again, HHRD openly holding conferences with Lashkar-e Taiba, of working with these Jamaati charities, which themselves openly finance terror, so on and so forth. They've been lobbying Congress, saying, you're getting bad information. All this is trolls and bots and weird conspiracy theorist kooks. And it's always amazing to me that they get away with that when I'm sitting here like, look, I'm just reading Pakistani media and reporting on it. What is your issue here?
And let's put that the way that interaction is funded by the taxpayer.
Right.
Tens of millions of dollars through State Department in USA. So in other words, the taxpayer is subsidizing a group who works very hard in DC to enable terrorist financing, to distract, to confound critics of terror finance, and to make it easier for terror financiers to operate in areas of the world where terrorists operate with impunity, subsidized by the taxpayer.
Is that still going on? Like, is that happening still?
Oh, yes. Look, we discovered this just a few months ago. Some of our contacts let us know that this was going on.
Wow.
And we hadn't been aware of it at all until not that long ago. And it was just then we started looking into it. And frankly, it wasn't that hard to find this information. And most of it is on the website. They aren't shy about it. So, no, it's absolutely still going on. And it's very interesting that they have chosen to do this. I am interested in figuring out who convinced them that this was a good idea. It would, if I were a charitable aid organization, coming to the aid of charities which have pretty clear terror finance ties would not be at the top of my list of things I wanted to be involved in. The aid organization gets enough criticism, has enough issues without standing up for, radical theocrats with, pretty clear terror finance problems. That wouldn't be the fight I would want to pick. Interesting.
Yeah, it is.
That fight.
The reason I was asking was, you have this Republican government in power, which is supposedly hard on Islamic terror, but at the same time, they've been in power for nearly 4 years, and this is still going on right under their noses. And I think, Cliff, this kind of brings to light again the point you were making about the lack of communication between different departments, right?
Yeah, and frankly, it's not continuing to go on. It's getting worse. It's getting significantly worse. And Sam wrote a large article explaining exactly how the Trump administration has not only not fixed this problem, but has exacerbated it. I'll let you go more in the details.
Yeah, I won't go into the full article. I do recommend your listeners go to the Elite Forum website and look for an essay called "American Islamism Flourishes Under Trump." And that's exactly what's happened. Under the Trump administration, American federal officials have continued to work with Islamists. Funding to Islamist organizations under this administration has gone up. More than under the Obama administration. That includes the $10 million to the Islamic Circle of North America, this Jamaat-i-Islami proxy. Trump promised in 2016 a number of things. He promised a commission on radical Islam. He promised that it would involve reformist voices. He promised to destroy the radicalization networks that underpin American Islamism. Of course, that includes Jamaat-i-Islami. None of that has happened. None of that has happened.
Wow.
The only thing he did was shut down the Countering Violent Extremism program, which had Islamist involvement. That was a good thing. They've just reintroduced it. It's back.
Right.
The very same program that pathetically fails to counter Islamism and usually enables Islamism.
Right.
So I can't point to a single success that the Trump administration has when it comes to domestic Islamism. Undoubtedly, the supporters will point to international Islamism, to the fight against ISIS and so on. I don't regard that as actually ultimately very important. It is domestically, it is a radicalized generation, a radicalized Muslim generation that will yield extremism and terror for many generations to come. That is the threat. And you'd have thought the one administration you could rely on to take a kind of aggressive view and an aggressive approach to this would be the Trump administration. But no,
that's insane.
Yeah, and I think honestly, I'm going to in part blame the Trump administration's own. They sort of stepped in their own trap in this to a certain degree, and it was understandable perhaps, but it doesn't excuse it. And that is, it is beyond reasonable debate, as far as I'm concerned, that the Obama administration not only ignored this concern, but actively made it worse. They refused to admit it was a problem. They opened the floodgates to Islamist organizations in terms of access. They legitimized them in ways that would not have otherwise happened. And that was wrong, and that was horrifying. The reaction to that from Donald Trump was to go way too far in the other direction, was to, essentially say, Muslims hate America. We need to ban Muslims from coming to this country. And we need to kill terrorist families. Some of the real extreme rhetoric which I certainly don't support, wouldn't support anything like it, and it really concerns me. And I think
it just defeats the purpose, right? Like if you're trying to defeat Islamism, it is not going to come from outside. It is most likely, in a lot of cases, going to come from inside.
Exactly.
So if you're going to ban all Muslims, then you're basically going to be banning reformists as well.
Exactly. And I mean, some of our most important intelligence assets from different countries, from Iran, from, Qatar, from 100 different places, they are people that we want here, that we need here.
Yeah.
They are people that want a moderate form of Islam, so on and so forth. But more than that, even putting aside that sort of rhetoric makes people, even people that are inclined to agree that Islamism is a problem, that radicalization is a problem, that these groups are not who they purport to be, so on and so forth. It makes them want to shy away a little for understandable concerns of, look, I believe there's a problem, but I also don't want to squeeze, ma and pa, your generic American Muslim that is not part of this, I don't want them caught in the crossfire. And so they'll kind of back away. I'm not, damning them for forever. I'm not saying this can't be fixed. I think there are ways that this can be fixed, even rhetorically. But I do think they sort of stepped in the trap that they themselves sprung. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I do believe that's unfortunate. That is crazy. I honestly had no idea that, funding for these organizations actually went up under Trump. That would surprise a lot of people, I bet. Also, I think, when you speak about matters getting not better, but actually worse under Trump for a bit, to what extent do you think, Sam, that's exacerbated by quote unquote savvy leaders like, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, that are a little bit of the flavor of the month right now, especially among liberal circles, liberal Democrats. They're the bit of a flavor of the month. And when they're espousing these causes like Kashmir and all of that stuff, and Hindu fascism, Jewish fascism, all of that stuff, those topics tend to become kind of trendy topics. And if you're like a young, impressionable kind of person that leans liberal, you're going to listen to these guys and you're going to think, oh my God, fascism. Oh, we can't have that, because you hear the word fascism and you can't support fascism, because once you start from that place, they'll ask you that, well, do you support fascism? Well, of course not. So
and that's kind of the funny thing is fascism, anybody that studies it and its history indeed is horrifying and nobody supports it. But that's kind of the problem insofar as nobody actually studies its history, and it has become to mean in many situations, that with which I disagree is essentially what fascism really means. And anybody I don't like is a fascist, and therefore, and obviously you don't support fascism either, so you also oppose what I oppose. So it's become sort of a a catch-all phrase that means anything somebody that has a bone to pick wants it to mean.
How much does it worry you, Sam, that these sort of trendy leaders at the moment are espousing these topics? Do you think that these organizations are gaining more influence because they're being supported and their ideologies are being supported by these sort of flavor of the month leaders at the moment?
Oh, no doubt. As I think I mentioned before, Islamists crave legitimacy more than anything.
Right.
To be recognized as Muslim leaders, even when they lack a mandate from ordinary Muslims. Nothing does that better than having a bunch of congressmen attend your events and speak your cause in Congress. The most important thing for legitimacy is to be funded by government.
Yep.
And at the moment, both the right and the left are funding and partnering with Jamaat-i-Islami and other Islamist groups. No doubt, people like Ilhan Omar are help, but the Trump administration sure isn't not helping either.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy. What kind of like? Let me see if you know anything about this at all. But have you seen any kind of like pushback from like the Indian consulate or the Indian government in this matter against these organizations speaking all these things about India? Let me go to Cliff for that.
Yes and no. I have spoken to people at the Indian embassy and discussed some of these issues with them. They agree. I know the ambassador has said, and other embassy officials said, look, we're in favor of HRES 160, the resolution I mentioned that condemns Jamaat-i-Islami, so on and so forth. And I think that's good. I do think they, and this is just my point of view. It's not my job to make the case of the Indian government for them or to set their priorities. But from my point of view, anyway, and this isn't just to the government. Frankly, this is to the wider South Asian community. For understandable reasons, there has been a sort of obsession over the Kashmir question itself.
Right.
What I mean by that is, oh, look, we think we are right on Kashmir, and we need to explain to everybody why we are right. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think is what they're missing, in my point of view anyway, is that you can say that, okay, look, you can be right on Kashmir and still be wrong on politics.
Right.
In other words, here's one thing I've heard from a lot of South Asians that I know, a lot of Indians, Hindus that I know, is that Jim Banks, who, as you mentioned, has been outspoken against Jamaat-i-Islami, who has introduced resolutions against them, also signed on to a resolution that was fairly mild, but was critical of the Indian government's handling of Kashmir. Said, hey, look, as soon as you can, you should lift the communications restrictions and all that kind of thing. It was fairly mild, but it was critical of the Indian government. And there was a number who were very angry with him. And I'm like, look, it is one thing to be critical of, hey, maybe you ought to lift, the communications restrictions pretty soon. That doesn't mean he's your enemy. What's really more important is, in my view, is not saying we're right on Kashmir. It should be making the case against India's enemies, because every reasonable person should be able to admit that Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and their supporters, Jamaat-i-Islami, so on and so forth, are not good from any sort of point of view that the wider American population would hold. I mean, the overwhelming majority. And I think they would do themselves a favor, both the Indian government and the wider Indian community and South Asian community, because it also includes Bangladeshis and stuff, which don't like Jamaat, don't like some of these radical groups, to go to take the fight to your enemies. Don't play defense.
Right. I think that does make a lot of sense. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I think people do get hung up on. I think people in India do get hung up on like. To an extent, at least some people, I think, get hung up on like defending every little aspect of the Indian government's decision on Kashmir or every little aspect of the Citizenship Amendment Act. There can be problems, within this. Once you take a decision that's as momentous and as monumental as the Citizenship Amendment Act, as the abrogation of Article 370, there are bound to be some problems within it. Whether it's implementation, whether it's within the law, there are going to be problems within it. So I think that's a very good point, Cliff, that rather than getting hung up on the minutiae of it, I think it's important to realize who's an ally and who's not, and sort of maybe go from there, right?
Yeah, that's what the point of view I would take, and I think that's something that it's a lesson that they hope they learn, because at the end of the day, we can debate, the finer points of what a relatively free secular democracy is doing.
Right.
And we can have those conversations between allies, but still recognize the big picture, which is that radicals, theocrats, so on and so forth, are a common enemy, and we should, criticize each other in a good faith way when we make mistakes, but that the big picture, we're on the same side.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Go on, Sam.
I mentioned, learning from maybe the mistakes made in defending Israel and against the pro-Hamas, the pro-terror, pro-Palestinian territories lobby. India can learn from that, and precisely as Cliff mentioned, one of the mistakes I think that the Jewish community made for many years was obsess over the minutiae of the conflict or of the agreement, forgetting often to point out that their main enemy is Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that wants to wipe Jews off the face of the earth. So, in the West, especially with people like me who are North Indian, and my job isn't to defend India or to defend the Modi government.
Right.
Who are interested in the conflict and see the Islamists as the greatest threat. We've all got to remember that the problem lies with the theocratic, genocidal intent at the heart of some of the groups behind Kashmiri violence.
Right.
That's what we have to remember. And yeah, Cliff's absolutely right. Let's not obsess over the minutiae. Let's deal with the ultimate ideological threat.
So let me stick with you, Sam. Finally, I just wanted to see if you guys had any ideas or recommendations as to how, either for the American government, either for civil society, either for India, either for Indians and sort of Muslims and South Asians living in the United States that don't necessarily agree with the exclusivist outlook of these Islamist organizations, if you have any recommendations for them for highlighting this issue better and combating this issue better and sort of bringing it to the mainstream in a better way.
Yeah, I think the most important, let's take the Muslim community. One of the reasons they don't have, moderate Muslims, reformist Muslims don't have community groups is that for decades, governments and media and politicians, for all the reasons we've discussed over the last hour, have been legitimizing the Islamists as leaders. There's no funding for the moderates. There's no space for the moderates.
Yep.
They have to self-organize. It's the only way to advance their interest and get rid of the Islamist agenda. There are smaller groups they can work with. Groups like the Muslim Reform Movement are doing fantastic things in pushing back Islamist influence and actually working with them, and not just American Muslims, but American, South Asians of all faiths. Working with groups like the Muslim Reform Movement too, because you have a shared interest, the threat of Islamism. There needs to be a much greater self-organization. But also, South Asian communities can do a lot. Those who share our concerns can do a lot by themselves as well as individuals. They can read our research. They can read the research of our allies, of Hindu groups around the country, and they can then contact their legislators. They can speak to journalists. They can act. They can run. The Islamists, including Jamaat-i-Islami, run lobby days in state capitals all across the country, and indeed, let's set up alternative lobbying days. Let's get an alternative voice out there. It needs self-organization. It needs something to combat Islamist wherewithal, Islamist know-how. That's what we need, and it's vital that we have it, because currently the Islamists are speaking on your behalf. Without your approval, without your mandate, we need to make it clear that they have no right, they have no mandate.
Right, that makes sense. Anything to add to that, Cliff?
No, I think Sam summed it up pretty well.
Okay. Well, guys, and finally, I want to really thank you for taking the time out of your day today and coming on the show, talking to me about this stuff. I think there's a lot here that you guys talked about that I honestly did not know about. I will be very surprised if a lot of people in India, or if a lot of Indians or South Asians in America would honestly know about these things as well. So thanks again. This was very enlightening.
Absolutely. Thanks you so much for having us on.
Absolutely. And Sam, just really quickly, you were talking about that article that's going to be coming up on Middle East Forum. Any idea as to a timeline as to when it might come out?
Oh, look next week. It should be
next
there.
Week?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe, guys, if once that article is out, sometime after that, maybe we can have another one of those discussions that are sort of maybe focused on the areas discussed in the article.
That would be great. And one plug, very quick.
Yeah, go on.
Do encourage everyone watching, listening to this, to sign up to the Middle East Forum's mailing list, particularly the Islamist Watch mailing list. You'll get all our research about Kashmir, about Islamists attacking India, about Islamists attacking Hindus. Sign up, and then you won't miss an article.
All right, awesome. I'll leave.
MEForum.org. It's MEForum.org is where you can.
MEForum.org. All right, I'll leave the link to the website in the description as well. I have the Twitter profiles of Cliff and Sam in the description as well. So go ahead and follow those guys. They're doing a lot of very interesting, very important work. So go check them out, guys. Once again, Cliff and Sam, thanks for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Other than that, thank you for watching today's episode. Thank you for everybody with the super chats. Thank you for everyone who commented, who is participating in the live chat. As usual, like, subscribe, support on Patreon, abuse, all of that fun stuff. I look forward to all of that stuff. Cliff and Sam, just stick around offline for a second. Sure. Guys, thanks again. I will see you for the next podcast. And until then, stay happy, stay healthy. I'll see you guys soon. All right.